Welcome back to the Book of James. Glad you joined me. I hope you're able to catch our introduction week last week. This week being lesson 1, jumping into verse 12. But we'll get into that in a little bit. I hope we have had a wonderful week since the last time we dug into this book. So let me just remind us of 3 questions that we just really as a background of what we're going to be reading and how we need to take what James is talking about. Those 3 questions are: who is James? When was James written? And what is James all about? What's its purpose? And reminder that James is the stepbrother of Jesus. Yes, Jesus had other family members. We know that mom and dad, Mary and Joseph, had other kids, and Jesus was one of them. And James was definitely one of them as well. And so there is a direct connection with Jesus as a family, as a sibling, and yet James still felt, hey, I need to write this. I need to pass this information on. The second question about when was it written? Most scholars would agree that it was around 40 AD, which Christ died somewhere around 30 to 33 AD. So within 7 to 10 years of Christ dying, resurrecting, and attending or returning to heaven, James felt the necessity to remind believers of a lot of important practices. And today it's about temptation and about our lifestyle. But as a nutshell, what is James all about? What is its purpose? Well, really, we want to see that James is writing again to a Jewish audience, that he is saying, hey, I know Christ died just, a handful of years ago, but we got to live our faith out. People have to see what Jesus is doing for us. And it's a great compliment to what Pastor John is going through in the book of Galatians on Sunday morning. If you haven't checked out his messages on Sunday mornings, check out the link in the description below and get connected with the previous messages of Galatians. And they're working hand in hand, James and Paul. Paul is saying, hey, we're saved. Our salvation is grace alone, through faith alone, through nothing else. We can't add anything to it. That's how we're saved. James is saying, well, as a result of us being saved and the excitement and our desire to follow Christ, we need to show Christ's love on how we act. The things that we do, the things that we say, they need to come through, and as a result, that we'll see today, protect ourselves as well. So let's go ahead and jump into the text then in James 1, verse 12 through 17. We'll kind of take it a couple verses here at a time and kind of talk through them. And then again, I got some questions at the end that I want us to kind of dive in. And even today, there's 3 examples, 3 characters that had their own struggles that we want to look at today too. So James 12, blessed is the one who perseveres under trials, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. I mean, this just echoes those first 8 verses about consider a trial joy. And those circumstances that we go through, that if we persevere underneath that trial, we've withstood that test, that tough time in our life, and we will receive the crown of life. The Lord is there watching and being there, that just because we go through a tough time doesn't mean the world is against us, doesn't mean God is against us. Matter of fact, we can see it's quite the opposite as we move on. But that we are going to face these troubles and these trials in life, and they're not from God. We're going to see that here. They're actually from Satan trying to distract us. Verse 13 goes on to say, when tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, but for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. God's not the tempter. Satan is. Our own evil desires, our own selfishness. I mean, if we, again, go back all the way to Adam and Eve, that's when sin entered the world. They disobeyed God, and as a result of that disobedience, we have this desire to sin, to go against God, to rebel against God, a part of who we are. And that's where a lot of those things come from. And so when we go through difficult situations or see something that causes us to go against God, it's not God throwing that in front of us. It's Satan saying, hey, I'm going to try and see if I can take your eyes off of God. And then as a result, you're going to blame God and have a bad attitude. And we need to keep that proper perspective. Verse 14, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. We each one are created unique and different, and as a result, each one of us has our own struggles, our own evil desires that will entice us or take us away from following God. Some of us, we can get angered very easily and having a temper that flies off the handle. Others of us are enticed and desire to look at inappropriate pictures of the opposite gender or online or on our phone. We're more enticed by that thing. Or the words or the language that we use, the jokes that we talk about with friends or coworkers. We can get drawn into those conversations more easily than others. Each one of us has a different set. And so I like how James is keeping it pretty broad, saying how our own evil desires, our own personal struggles are the ones that are drawing us into this temptation. We also see in verse 15 that then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and to sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. Think of a pyramid right at the bottom of evil desires is right there. I mean, each one of us, it's the biggest platform we have, our own thoughts, our own ideas, our own words, and out of that comes these temptations that are tailored to us, that are built upon those evil desires. And right there, we're doing okay. I mean, we're going to have our desires that we need to deal with. We're going to have temptations that we're going to face. But once we start giving in to those temptations, and this is where Paul is in verse 15, it says, hey, after that is given birth, after that begins, and we start digging into those temptations, now we're crossing over into that sin category, that top little third, section toward the top of the pyramid. And if we're not careful and we continue to live in that sin and give into those temptations out of our evil desires, we're not only going to give into sin, we're going to go into death. We're going to, be separated and pulling ourselves out from church, pulling ourselves out from fellowship, pulling ourselves away from God, and completely being isolated into that death category. And so we got to start at the bottom. Watch, what are our own evil desires? Can we use God and our accountability with other believers to step away from those before temptation? And once temptation hits, how do we step back and go, okay, I need to avoid that so we don't give into sin and we don't give in ultimately into death and that separation from God and God's family. Verse 16, don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Don't be deceived. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. I mean, this is our encouragement on our lifestyle and how we live, that God is gracious. He wants to give us goodness. He wants to give us a blessing. He wants to give us an amazing life. But we have Satan on the other side. We have him drawing and giving us those evil desires, those temptations to draw us away. And, if we're thinking us 2,000 years after Christ, how are we supposed to keep our eyes on Christ? Well, look at these three guys. There's three guys that were there, that they interacted with God in a very personal way. Paul being one, right there, persecuting Christians in the early church, and he even said, hey, you know what, there's times where I do what I don't want to do, and there's times I don't do what I want to do. I mean, he's in this conflict of temptation as well. And so I encourage you to check out Romans 7:21 through 25 and see what Paul was writing about and how he needs to stay strong and step through it. Another one is in David. This is Old Testament, and he, in this passage, he just got done having an affair with another man's wife, and he's like, man, I want to follow God, I want to do what he says, and yet God calls him a man after his own heart, and David's coming clean here, saying, hey, you know what, I struggle, God, make me new, create in me a clean heart. So I encourage you, check out Psalm 51, 1 through 6, and then the third guy that comes to mind is Daniel. The same guy, Daniel in the lion's den. He is one that is taken into captivity. He is brought out of his own land. He is struggling to follow God in a new territory where they have new gods, lower G, new gods to follow, and he is turning to God himself to say, God, don't let me be tempted. I need to follow you. I need to keep you in front so I don't fall away. And he writes a great set of encouragement in Daniel 9:4-6. And so take time to read those about those three guys, their own struggle with temptation and how they were blessed with it, how they were encouraged through it, and ultimately they give us some wisdom on how we can deal with those things as well. And so I want to wrap this time up with 4 questions. 4 questions that we can take with us, either as a family or as an individual, and kind of work through and remind ourselves kind of really what James was talking about. First question, how is a person blessed who perseveres through a trial or under a trial? How do we as a Christian become blessed when we go through those? Second question is, what does it mean to persevere through and under a trial? Now those are 2 different questions. One is, what is the blessing? And the other is, how do we actually go through it? How do we, in reflection of last week's, can keep our joy and yet go through a difficult and struggle? How do we actually physically make it through one of these trials? Third question is, if temptation doesn't come from God, then where does it come from? Where does temptation, that desire, come from? And it helps us keep our focus. And then lastly, what is the actual whole process Paul warns us about? Those steps, I'll give you a hint, it's a progression of 4 different items, kind of like a pyramid, and take it and evaluate your own lives and go, okay, what is my own set of things that causes me to be tempted and go astray? And so I encourage you to check those out. Go back and reread the verses we read today, 12-17, and then re-hit these 4 questions and kind of talk about how we can maintain a lifestyle of temptation that we can overcome through God's help and reaching others in the name of Christ. And again, we're 2,000 years after Christ, and James wrote this to people that were there 7 to 10 years and then circulated just shortly thereafter Christ had died, and they needed a reminder as well. And so I encourage us to take this with us, think through those words of James, and find a way that we can truly be the hand and feet of Jesus to the people around us, especially through this crazy time of the coronavirus scare, influenza, sickness and wellness, or sickness and wellness, and even social distancing and having to kind of self-isolate ourselves, that we can find ways to encourage one another and also be able to reach out to one another. So again, thank you so much for being with me today. This is the book of James. Thank you.